Hello, everybody. My name is Valentin Veron-Toma. I'm a medical anthropologist at the Francisc E. Reiner Institute of Anthropology of the Romanian Academy in Bucharest. I will act as a convener of this panel. And first of all, I would like to thank all those present today at the Medical Humanities panel held at the MedLife 2020 conference entitled Medicine and Anthropology in the Context of the Pandemic, Adaptive Strategies. The theme of our panel is the following, the end of the novel pandemic coronavirus, and lessons learned from the historical epidemics and their values in shaping intervention strategies in the current pandemic and its aftermath. I would like to greet my distinguished guests, Professor Stuart Bloom from the University of Amsterdam, Professor Tamara Vernick from Institut Pasteur, Professor Vincenzo Di Napoli, Université de Montréal, Dr. Dora Vargas, University of Exeter. Thank you for joining us today. And I would like first to invite you to say a few words about yourselves and to say a few words about your interest in the topic of our panel. Who would like to start? Tamara, maybe you would like to start?
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I'm Tamara Giles Vernick. I lead the anthropology and ecology of disease emergence at Institut Pasteur. I am a medical anthropologist and historian, so I work at that intersection in my unit, and I work on disease emergence, primarily zoonotic diseases, both slow-moving epidemics. We also work on responses to epidemic emergencies as well as ongoing health problems, namely viral hepatitis. I also coordinate a global network funded by the European Commission called Sonar Global. It's a global network of social scientists for the preparation and response to epidemics and antimicrobial resistance. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. Stuart?
My name is Stuart Bloom. I'm Emeritus Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Amsterdam, but I'm also part of the Department of Anthropology. I'm originally from the UK, where I, among other things, worked in the British Ministry of Health as Secretary of a Government Committee on Social Inequality and Health. That's a long time ago. I've been in the Netherlands a long time. And my research over all these years has been specifically on the development and introduction of new technologies in medicine. And for the last 15 years, I've been looking at specifically at vaccines, the development and introduction and evaluation of new vaccines. So my interest specifically in the present epidemic is the development of the numerous vaccines that we now are being promised so much about.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Vincenzo?
Well, good morning from Montreal. It's 6 o'clock here. My name is Vincenzo Di Napoli. I'm originally from Italy. Grew up and was educated in North America and in Europe later. So I have three roles. I'm a child specialist as a child psychiatrist and pediatrician. I'm a social and cultural psychiatrist, and my more recent training is in philosophy. So I have a number of concerns about the pandemic. Historians have said that pandemics are even more impactful than wars or revolutions, and I'm thinking about that all the time. As a child specialist, I'm thinking that this is a generation that will be marked by the pandemic. The second thought I want to share and elaborate with the group this morning or today is the notion of confinement as a metaphor. Now, confinement in medicine means labor, when a woman goes into labor, and it says a lot about the way birth was seen, in that the woman was confined, the woman was set apart. And also confinement in the history of psychiatry refers to a period in the 17th and 18th century where the people that are socially undesirable and otherwise excluded from society were set aside and confined, sometimes in a pleasant way and in rural areas, and sometimes in more unpleasant ways in which they were literally excluded and sent away. Finally, I'm concerned about social distancing. I understand the medical, I am a physician, I understand the medical needs for all of this. At the same time, it's not black and white, and my concerns are, how do we balance rights, the impact on society, the impact on development, and the notion of the need for society and belonging in the light of a pandemic, which will not go away. Vaccines are not in a couple of, a few months, or perhaps even a few years. We're going to have to learn to live with it in a more balanced way.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo. And now I would like to hear a few words from Dora.
Hi, my name is Dora Vargas. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Exeter in Medical Humanities. I'm at the History Department and also part of an interdisciplinary center called the Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health. I've done work on, I'm mostly interested in the politics of the epidemics and politics of vaccination and hospital treatment. And that I've done work on the Cold War politics of polio epidemics. So I'm very interested in the geopolitics of disease. I tend to look at it from what we usually think about as the periphery, so from an Eastern European perspective. And I would argue that that is a very useful thing to do. And this work has brought me to think about the epidemic timelines and temporalities and how we determine the end of an epidemic and what happens after. And finally, I'm also working on socialism and the history of socialism and global health to try to rewrite the history of global health as we tell it by integrating Eastern European, Soviet, and the basically socialist world perspectives spanning from Vietnam through Cuba to Angola. And recently I've done some work for WHO, a Western Pacific office on thinking about history and how history can be a partner for public health planning and planning for the future of the pandemic. And here at the center, I'm also part of the WHO Collaborating Center for WHO Europe.
Thank you very much, Dora. Thank you, all of you, for these interesting presentations. And I would like to mention in the beginning a few questions that we are going to focus on during this panel. For instance, how and when will the COVID pandemic end? Will there be one end or more? What happens after the current pandemic ends? The aftermath. We have to think of the next step, the next events. What will be the lasting impact of this event? What is the lesson that we learn from different epidemics and pandemics in the past? And do they hold any value for today and for future strategies to mitigate the effects of the pandemic? And what is the contribution of medical humanities and especially ongoing research to establish intervention strategies after the end of the current pandemic? And I would like to start with the first question, and I would like to hear your opinion, your answer on that. Can we talk about a single end for the current pandemic, or several different ends for different geographical regions or social groups? What do you think? Who would like to start to comment on this? maybe Dora, because you have published extensively on the topic of ends, not the end. You are suggesting that we should consider and conceptualize different ends, not only the end of the biological phenomenon, but also a social end. What can you tell us about this?
Thank you. Well, I'll try to be concise about this because I can go on for hours, believe me. What I've been thinking about is the way that we think about the epidemic timeline is almost fitting on the bell curve that we know as the representation of cases, and there's a beginning, there's a crisis point, and then a sort of withering away of the case numbers and the epidemic, and I think this is a useful way of thinking about how epidemics work, but it's also a seductive narrative. It's useful because there are so many uncertainties and unplannable things, and quite a number of it is quite unbearable, especially if we think about the pressure on medical staff and also on patients and the experiences of patients, or the loss of families. So there is a comfort in knowing that it will come to an end, that there will be a downward phase of this curve. But that kind of yearning for the ending, that there will be an end to this, and it's an event, it's a critical event. But how we determine where that end is also very important, because that determination of I'm very interested in who gets to say that it's over. If a national government says that, okay, this epidemic is no more, we have assess the numbers, the downward trends, and this is it. That comes with serious consequences for funding. It comes serious consequences for priorities. Also, I'm sure Vincenzo can speak to the way that it might affect people's behavior. And suddenly, there is not that kind of pressure. But it might not mean the same thing for everyone. It might not mean the same thing within Romania. It might not mean the same thing within Europe or globally. And I think so geographically, yes, I think there is a question of when that ends. If it ends everywhere in the world, or if it ends in key places that are prioritized over others. What happens to the places where it's that are not prioritized? If it's about maybe not a threat to an older population, but then what happens to younger people, or the other way around? And finally, there is that kind of pinpointing of ending can also mean that there might be attention shifted away from the longer consequences of the disease on a personal level. So I'm thinking about what is emerging as long COVID. When is the epidemic over if people are actively living with it and need active care continuously? And I'll leave it at there because it's a very big, big question.
Yes.
Just to start out with these, it's a very messy process, and there's a lot of multiple ways in which it plays out.
Yes, long-term consequences are of interest today for today's panel, because we are going to refocus our attention, or our audience's attention, from the acute phase of the pandemic to next phases, and what's happening in the long run to different social groups and different regions in the same country or at a global scale. And recently has been conceptualized a disease cluster named Coronaphobia, which is a new psychiatric entity, my dear Vincenzo. So we are going to discuss of a shift in our classifications, maybe in the future, and to take care of different categories of patients in the near future. We are going to need different kinds of medical services, maybe personalized in a way for these new categories and for these different kind of illnesses. What do you think of this long-term view and the ends, different ends for different age groups and different fragilities?
I'd like to speak to that, actually. First of all, I really agree with Dora that we can't have a one-size-fits-all answer. One of the slogans I heard early on in this pandemic was that we may all be in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I think that slogan or that way of looking at it holds. It may not even be the same storm for many people. I mean, some people are biologically, socially, and economically, perhaps even politically, comparatively safer or protected. Before we go into the social and psychiatric aspects, though, even biologically, I'm not sure what an end to the pandemic really means. There will be an end to the contagious phase, and there will be degree of so-called herd immunity, which is, I think, an awful phrase, by the way, reduces us to animals. And I think this has been commented on by a lot of people. But this sort of collective immunity that has to have a certain percentage before it's effective for the community is problematic, even though I tend to think of behavior and of society with an N greater than 1 as a social psychiatrist. At the same time, people do live this individually. And I think the real answer is going to be, there are very different kinds of answers. As for coronaphobia, I think that what's happening is, it's not simply that the pandemic is horrific in itself, but I think the way it is being politicized, if you wish, or at least mediated literally by social media and even by supposed science. By the way, I have a comment as a physician. Why do we keep speaking of science instead of epidemiology, virology, and so on? We've collapsed all the people at the table into this thing called science with a capital S, as if there's no disputes or there's no different perspectives on that. And I think that is part of coronaphobia. Part of coronaphobia, whatever that is, however we define it, will be also how people respond, the people that resist, the people that see it as political, the people that see it as being imposed on them, the people that see it from a libertarian perspective, and so on. However, as a clinician, I also am seeing people whose innate sensibility, I like to use that word, sensitivity, tendency towards being anxious about things, being worried about things, is being exaggerated, amplified by these circumstances. So there's always a fertile terrain that's available within the world, in the panoply of possible human reactions and histories that will bring forth a given reaction. It's very instructive to see which societies have been able to control it better, which regions, and people speak about, for example, the successes of South Korea or of China. But some things are not politically acceptable in a country like Canada and notably the United States, where people don't like to have their civil liberties as they conceive of them curtailed. So all of these things have to be brought into the mix. But I think the phobia will be both real in some people who are sensitive and exaggerated or lived vicariously as a social phenomenon. The last thing I want to say about that right now is the social distrust that I believe Dora spoke to is important, and that is going to undermine the sense of social belonging, so that we have conspiracy theories. Even when the vaccine becomes available, there are already anti-vaxxers for well-established vaccines.
Yes.
Will people accept this particular vaccine if they're in denial about the nature of the virology to start with?
You're right, and you said about how it's presented in the media and social media, and I remember trying to do something about infodemics with Tamara a few months ago, and we wanted to study this phenomenon of infodemics, but I would like to ask you, Tamara, because you are very interested in the origins of epidemics.
Mhm.
What do you think of the ends of the epidemic?
I think that the ends are as messy as the beginnings, in a way. You know, just to
It's a symmetry.
I think so. You know, I've been really intrigued by both Dora's work and her insights into the kind of very messy consequences and decentering these epidemics. But we see that same kind of messiness where you know, the identification of a beginning, of an origin, effectively targets this moment where a person and an infected animal come into contact with one another. And yet, you know, so that's where, in effect, this history begins. And yet, you know, I think that we need to pull back, because focusing on that moment shears off the very long-term processes that would bring human beings and infected animals together. And this is a big problem with the ways in which HIV has been written about. But I think also that HIV narrative, how it began, has been mapped onto the beginnings of a whole host of other epidemics, including this one. So, you know, the idea that it began, well, depending on where you think it began, and you know, in a wet market, about the, you know, contact between human beings and, you know, either raised or wild meat. So that I think elides a whole host of processes that would have brought that would have achieved this moment. The other thing that I think I'd like to pick up on from both of the speakers is that I think when we decenter the focus on North America and Europe and start to look at the end of a pandemic, or even the beginning of a pandemic, from a different perspective, you know, I'd like to direct our attention to countries in the global south, and particularly on the African continent, where this epidemiologically, at least what we've seen so far, is that this pandemic has not had the kind of effect in terms of mortality and morbidity that it has in other countries. At the same time, people have had to cope with confinement, all kinds of mobility restrictions, and they've also coped with a whole series of epidemics, non-going endemic diseases that came previously. And so this pandemic is not the kind of rupture and explosion that it may be experienced as in North America or Europe, but I think that some researchers have pointed out it just kind of gets rolled into a very long history of human suffering, and of interventions and of restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. One last point that I want to make about both about the ends of epidemics is one of the things that we've seen with a whole series of Ebola epidemics is that it doesn't just end when there's no more transmission. In the sense that people have to deal with the long-term psychological consequences of these. So Vincenzo, you can probably speak to that. but also the consequences, not just of the epidemic itself, but of the response effort. So for instance, in Equateur province, in Democratic Republic of Congo, people are dealing with, real serious economic difficulties, maybe because they lost a key person in their family, maybe because they're dealing with the consequences of long Ebola, which has not been studied, maybe because they're dealing with escalating prices of basic goods because you had a whole response effort coming in, commandeering vehicles, driving up prices and the like. So these kinds of consequences have effects on the economic life of people, have effects on the kind of social fabric that would in effect bring people together, has consequences for long-term well-being. So I know that that's a little bit far afield, but I think that it's not that it's going to repeat itself in this situation, but I think it does raise questions that we need to be asking over the longer term and over the coming months and years. So I'll stop.
I fully agree. I fully agree, and this is why I was thinking of something challenging for medical practitioners involved in the first line of dealing with the pandemic. I wanted to bring a new perspective from medical historians and medical anthropologists in order to engage them in a different kind of discourse and a different kind of practices for the near future and in the long run. It's very important to prepare their minds and to have them ask the same questions that researchers are asking from decades now. And this is why I would like to ask Stuart the same question, single ends or different ends, and what does it mean to look at different ends from different perspectives at European scale and global scale? What do you think, Stuart? Unmute yourself,
what
please.
Perhaps has not been mentioned up till now by my previous speakers is the fact that this is a far more political issue than perhaps we're inclined to think. I would put question mark around the very notion of a we who can talk about anything. Somebody made the point that, Vincenzo, I think, made the point that we're not all just scientists. We look at things with different disciplinary perspectives. Now, I think just as we know that the start's highly political, we all know that there have been reluctance or in some places to disclose numbers, to accept the existence. There was criticism of the WHO, the way it turned the H1N1 into a pandemic. So there are a lot of political interests involved, not only in declaring a pandemic, but in acknowledging the end of one. So that's part of it. So I don't think it's... And then added onto that is the fact that we look at different things from our different disciplinary perspectives. So, of course, a virologist or an epidemiologist will look at different things from an economist or an anthropologist. So, but these voices, these perspectives don't have equivalent weight or authority. So the tendency will certainly be to declare the pandemic ending or ended, depending on transmission rates or numbers of cases. But to an anthropologist or a psychiatrist or an economist, that won't be the end of the pandemic. But I would say, because we will look at the emotional and social and psychological costs that people will be paying for years to come. Some of us will look at the destruction of livelihoods and the increases in inequality and poverty, both in countries and between countries. Some voices just count more heavily than others. And so I don't think it's even meaningful to say, to even conceive of an agreed end to a pandemic because of its political and these perspectival differences. But I suspect the tendency will be to go along with the epidemiologists and at a certain moment to say it's over because the numbers of new cases is this, or the R number, which nobody had heard of except for epidemiologists a year ago. The R number was now 0.5. And of course, a difference also between that perspective and those of us, and the perspectives of those of us coming from the humanities and social sciences, economic interests. It's no accident that such faith has come to be placed in the existence and the potential of a vaccine. Vaccines make money. Other sorts of interventions just cost money. But I'll leave it at that for the moment.
That is so intriguing. I'm really glad you brought these things up. One of the ways in which I like to comment about this is also wearing my hat as a philosopher. Giorgio Agamben was one of my doctoral dissertation supervisors. He's an Italian philosopher known for very nuanced, very, very finely thought through differences. And for example, he is the philosopher of difference and of subtlety. And he came out with a position that sounds very much like the right wing in the United States or in different countries, and notably in the Western world, which I know best. And we find this strange group of friends, the libertarians that tend to be from the right, and these sensitive readings of society through philosophy, history, the medical humanities. And I think they come together in this way. The right wing, notably the United States and advanced countries, economically advanced countries, would worry about the economics and protecting business. And that is not something to dismiss completely because it has human impacts at every significant level. But the other side comes to meet it in terms of Giorgio Agamben asked the question, well, if we're going to confine ourselves, if we cannot attend to a wedding, if we can't celebrate a baptism or attend to the final days and hours of someone in an ICU, and we can't even accompany them in a funeral home or go to the cemetery with them, what's life for? If we're going to strip human life of these rituals and this sense of social belonging, you mentioned the social fabric of society, what's the whole point of living? I mean, people go to war, sacrificing their lives, their livelihood, treasure, and so on for values. Are we in the moral equivalent of a war? And so this is this, you know, I think traumas, tragedies, pandemics, revolutions make for strange bedfellows. And I think some of the strange things that I'm seeing is how people are separating themselves out into different kinds of communities, not just in science, but across all the disciplines. And I think that's very important to think about. So my concern as a philosopher is, how are we going to reimagine nature? We talked about, we just heard about the animal-human interface. Well, there's many strains in that. It's not just protecting, being a good shepherd of the earth and taking care of the natural world, but how do we conceive of the natural world? There's a strain of millennialism in this. There's a strain of kind of apocalyptic thinking. Some people see it as our task to protect the environment. Others see it as we are the danger to the environment. I think these threads are kind of both coming apart and coming together. And I think they will be revisioned by all the disciplines that are represented here today because of the pandemic. And I think this notion that Agamben asks, what is the whole point of life? If we're reduced to just being victims of a virus and needing to protect ourselves from that. There was a certain point in the HIV scare where people, after months, years of protecting themselves, just decided to let go. I had many friends, I have a brother that died of AIDS in Brazil, and in the gay and other communities at risk. People just decided at a certain point that just were not going to protect themselves anymore. But it wasn't a conscious, thoughtful decision. It was a drift. It was a sense of fatigue. And I'm really worried about the fatigue that's setting in and all of the attitudes, including towards so-called science, medicine, vaccines, that this will trigger.
Yes, quite recently, WHO conceptualized the pandemic fatigue. People are getting tired, you know. They don't want anymore to listen to orders coming from authorities and to submit to different, you know, kind of restrictions. So yes, I think in the near future, this fatigue will also change the realities, the social realities, and we can see that after this moment described by this great philosopher of isolation, confinement, and asking ourselves what is the meaning of life, I think this is one. This is another consequence of this kind of event. We are going to ask about the meaning of life in the future on long term, not only nowadays when we want to survive first, you know, and this is coming with different physiological effects and somatic effects, and then social effects. So I think this dissolution of the social life caused by the response to the pandemic will be part of the problem in the future. So it's not just that we are going to mitigate the effects. We have to think of the effects of the mitigation strategies in the future. Well, do you think the new normal will be extremely different, somewhat different, or maybe we're going to forget about these and return to a normal as previously we enjoyed our lives and our lifestyles? And what do you think of this coming back to what was before, or reinventing our new normal? What do you think of this antithesis between normal and new normal? Maybe Tamara would like to say something, because you are studying social media and you are going to say something based on your research on all sort of discourses intersecting on the topic of all normal, new normal, and authorities versus normal people.
Sure. In fact, I was laughing because I was thinking, I don't know how to answer that question.
Brilliant.
Yeah. So what just by way of background, we actually have been doing some social media monitoring, both in France, and pairing it with online sort of discussions around masks, around vaccines, around science, the big category, and what people are saying on the ground in their offline behavior. And you know, again, that those categories are worth thinking about. I guess I don't even really love the question, simply because what we call I don't know what is normal. This is a question that's been asked over and over again. And how is normality? How is normality made? And do we get to go back to something? I seriously doubt it. I think if we could potentially look back into the past, it's not that things will change in the same way. It's not, sort of that somehow something will repeat itself, but I think what we'll probably see are incremental changes in diverse modes of life experienced in different ways depending on where you are on the planet. That's not a very satisfying answer for you, but I'm not in the habit of looking into a crystal ball and predicting the future. And so there's a kind of impossibility to answering this question.
Yeah, but I was thinking of what Vincenzo said about this isolation and suspension of social rituals. Do you think that we're going to come back to our social life using the same social practices, or we're going to reinvent them, adapt them to, for instance, an endemic stage of the pandemic?
Sure. I mean, I think even this event, for instance, it reflects a kind of reinvention of how you bring people together. I mean, how many of us have been in Zoom conferences or Zoom roundtables over the last year? I think that even sociality among researchers has, and in the exchange of knowledge and insights has been completely transformed in the last several months. And I'm not sure that it's going to go back to anything that we were doing before, where I think many of us were, flying all over the place and going here and there. And, now we're not doing that anymore. And I doubt that there will be a tolerance for that. So that's a very small intervention. But I'd like to stop there, because I really, again, I'm not someone who looks into a crystal ball and prognosticates.
What do you think, Dora?
Yeah, I was thinking something along the same lines, but also that what is the normal anyway? That we are in a new normal, right? In a way, when we leave home, we check for our keys, our wallet, our phone, and our mask, right? That it becomes, things become part of life that is already counts as normal. In the kind of abnormalities have transformed of what we count as abnormal and what is becoming accepted. And I think I'm more interested in, I mean, as a historian, I'm of course always interested in change over time and ruptures and continuities. We have to see that it's not a watershed event that will fundamentally change everything, right? There's already studies of how people are expecting to travel even more once it's possible again, because now the value of that possibility has gone up. Or those, in the UK, for instance, car sales have gone up because people have been, that kind of what counts as safety and responsible way of moving around is being transformed. So these are small changes that add up and change fundamental aspects, I think. But what I'm also very interested in is the inequalities that the practices that we develop now and that stay over will change. I mean, what we're doing right now is, on the one hand, is a very egalitarian, because everybody can participate. You don't need to move continents, and we can have a chat with Montreal and UK, and everybody can come together very easily. But then what you do need is a very dependable internet connection for this, and the technology. So you cannot anymore, tell someone, okay, come, I have the funds, I'll just fly you over so you can participate. No, if I cannot buy you internet connection, and I cannot send you a computer. If you don't have access to that, you will not be able to participate. So there is, and a lot more inequalities also in scientific knowledge production of who has access to being, who can do research, because that, the kind of research that is possible now with these limited ways is also a question: will that gain precedence? Will more people be doing certain kinds of research and not others, simply because that is now what's possible? Yes. And that has long-term consequences. And there are many examples also of obviously the economic factors of what kind of work becomes even more valued and possible. I mean, the home working, the privilege of being able to work from home, as opposed to people who do have to go out, and how that value of that work is changing. So I think there is a lot of ways in which things have already changed, and that the things have already become normal that in March or February we thought to be unimaginable. But again, historian looking backwards, not forward. So it's difficult to say. And one on a final note, maybe a more positive note, looking back, there are of course a lot of ways in which epidemics, and here reflecting on what Vincenzo brought up about epidemics are like wars or are these major crisis events. But on the other hand, I'm also wary of giving too much purchase for the epidemics, because we'll see how much this really changes things. How it depends on so many things. If maybe we're out of this and immediately another one comes along, that this will be sort of a very different conversation after that. And also speaking to what Tamara said, it matters where you are and what the new normal comes, because if you're in a context where the normal is that you have an ongoing epidemic all the time and there's always restrictions and always some kind of crisis, then that is already, it's not a game changer.
Many healthcare practitioners consider that the healthcare systems fail to deal with the challenge of a pandemic. There is a need of restructuring the healthcare system, national healthcare systems, and new technologies. What do you think, Stuart? Is it possible to go back to the old normal when we consider the failure of the national healthcare systems in dealing with the pandemic, or there is a need to do something, to invest in different ways and have different strategies?
Well, let me just say something that I wanted to say before you ask me that question, Valentin.
Yes, please.
I think in response to the previous speakers, I think the capacity to adjust our rituals and our practices to changing circumstances is the prerogative of the privileged among us. And in that sense, as academics, we are privileged. We can adjust our modes of interacting and our modes of researching. Many people whose livelihoods have disappeared are not in a position to do that. I think we ought to recognize that the capacity to adjust is a privileged one. So far as healthcare systems are concerned, I wish it were possible to rationally design and redesign healthcare systems. I mean, I've been studying quite a lot of the time the last years how new vaccines get introduced. And in lots of countries, people have produced committees have produced guidelines to. These are the criteria which we ought to bear in mind when introducing a new vaccine. The reality is that it doesn't work like that. The reality is that it's far more political. People rationalize, because we expect, or the world out there expects our policymakers to make rational decisions.
There is a glitch here, but Stuart, do you hear me?
Pandemic, because we've been unwilling and we had difficulty in considering alternatives which are socially and politically much more problematic, and for politicians cost instead of providing political and social capital. So I suppose some healthcare systems will be more able to adjust and learn from what's been going on now, but many will not, partly because they're mainly funded from outside by international donors. They'll have to do what the donors are willing to pay for. It's very difficult. Everybody's been saying the same thing. It's so difficult to generalize, but I'm probably more skeptical about the place of rationality in decision-making than most of my colleagues.
I think that's so well said. I don't know if there was unnormal before. There were many normals, many traditions, and I think there will be many new normals. And I think the notion of an endemic is very interesting, so that there will be adaptations. I think pedagogy will change radically. You know, I live in Canada. I live in a jurisdiction, Quebec, that has the cheapest, well, the least expensive to the individual education in North America. I mean, it's better than most of the rest of Canada, and it's a tenth, a 1/25th of the cost of a university education in the United States. And for all that money that's paid, and I've been to Harvard, I teach at Harvard as well. For all that money, what are you really paying for? I mean, when you can do much of this online, when information is available as never before online, you don't have to have, you don't have to be within walking distance of the Bodleian library at Oxford. I mean, you can access it online. So what are we paying all this money for? And why are we having people like us, you know, that travel internationally to go to congresses? Why are we having this huge carbon footprint by traveling when we can do this otherwise? So I think pedagogy will change. I think we're going to rethink things. In terms of healthcare systems, you know, again, I live in a comparatively socialistic society, and just next door is a society that believes you can run public services and utilities on a per-profit basis. In Quebec, in Canada, if there's an economic hit, the hospitals will still stay open. They won't make money, but they'll still stay open because it's a public service. I'm paid by the government. I'm not paid by a private insurer. So I think there's many lessons that we already know that will be heightened. So I think some things are not exactly predictable, but we can extrapolate the trends. Yes, the last thing I want to say about this is, yes, we are privileged if we want things to be the same, as a famous Italian novel once said. You know, if you want things to stay the same, things will have to change. That is if you want to maintain your privilege. But I want to remind us, I mean, I come from a very poor immigrant family. And even in Italy, we're, you know, among the poor, the landless peasants, in terms of my personal tradition. I mean, these people can be tremendously resilient. If you don't have a lot to lose, you can adapt traditions, rituals very well. You know, when I go to Port-au-Prince in Haiti and do consultations there, or my consultations in the favelas in Brazil, where I often visit and consult, these people are tremendously, this is famous resilience. They're tremendously adaptive. So I think some of the change will come from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. People like us who are privileged may want to maintain our privilege or maintain the activities we do, and we have the kinds of adaptations that will make that possible, probably. But also, let's not forget that from the bottom up. I mean, bottom in this economic sense, and from from the people up. I think that they will also generate interesting adaptations. So I'm guardedly optimistic that we will deal with it. What we will deal with it and what will emerge, I have no idea. But I'm very sure that humanity will do something to emerge, and there'll be many different answers.
Can I just quickly reflect on the healthcare system?
Yes, please.
So one of the things that historians of epidemics argue is that epidemics make visible, all these things that usually are not visible, and
yes,
you can get a look at the normal, in a very new light, and that is partly what's happening with, I think, with healthcare systems. And it also creates, I would like to, although I usually share Stuart's views on the kind of pessimistic views on this, but it also creates an opportunity, I think, to reassess, what works and what needs to be pushed for, and that works in both ways. I mean, what you can see in the UK is that this opportunity has been taken to actually privatize and work against that the current system. So it's like an opportunity where there's not much oversight because of a crisis, and you can really push in and do things that would be otherwise politically unacceptable. But there are also ways in which we can see that the societies, that are more or less more successful than others, maybe in dealing with this, are the ones that have very stable primary healthcare system and laboratory networks, right? So that the kind of very basic issues that actually need quite an investment from annual GDP, because it needs maintaining, and it needs to be tied into a system not too centralized but not too decentralized. So drawing on local knowledge, but also centrally mobilizable. And this is what we see, for instance, happening in Germany throughout this year. So these are, I think, and this really brings to, I think, what I see, happening in Hungary, for instance, is that there you have already crumbling system that is really pushed to the edge, and we might not even know exactly what's going on because it's difficult to get a sense. It's politically, as Stuart has emphasized, it's politically it's so political. Health is always so political. Especially in these moments of crisis, where governments have to prove that they have a handle on things. The issue of trust comes in, which is really crucial.
They don't want to lose face.
Sorry? Yes,
they don't want to lose face.
But it's also, but it's also like you have to present yourself as some kind of leader. If that's not working out, like in the UK, then even what should be working is not working anymore, because that kind of trust and relationship is frayed. It's a very delicate situation, but it will, I'm on an optimistic note, it can give new ways to address already existing problems that become very visible and very acute suddenly.
In the same direction, there is a huge, tremendous hope that vaccines will be the instrument to bring our lives back to, the old realities, and we are going to live our lives fully, completely, without, taking care of ourselves and our masks and our, current restrictions and fears. Stuart, you said that you are not quite convinced that vaccines are the solution, and I would like to ask you to comment on that a little bit more.
Well, I think they're a very good thing. I'm not anti-vaccination in the slightest bit, but I'm a critical vaccinationist. Actually, I wrote in April or May that we shouldn't think that when a vaccine has been proven effective, that our problems are over. Now, finally, but of course, nobody wanted to talk about, everybody wanted to hope that when there's a vaccine, it will solve all our problems. Of course, now we're starting to see that there are a whole lot of other issues like distribution, like cost, like the duration of protection, like the possibility of side effects, in particular, as yet undefinable groups. So it's interesting that these questions, which certainly were identifiable, and I actually wrote about them 6 months ago, are only now starting to be discussed. Hope trumps everything, especially when it's combined with enormous economic and geopolitical interests. I mean, what I've been writing these last years is that vaccines in the 1980s became commodified. They became essentially a source of commercial, of economic capital. Now they're being turned into a source of political capital as well. What we're seeing now is only partly about public health. It's partly about geopolitical influence. So I think it's my job as a social scientist, and I will extend to historians the same. It's part of our job is to criticize the taken for granted. It's what I've been teaching my students all through my academic career. Our job is to say, what are the questions nobody wants to ask, and why don't they want to ask that question? So vaccines have a place, have a part to play, but I mean, I'm supposed to write something with an old friend of mine in India who's a medical sociologist. What's happening with tuberculosis in India? People are not being treated. Vaccines will help us solve a little bit of the problem, but that's all. The reason they're given so much emphasis is they can be turned into a source of hope, and they are a source of commercial and political capital.
You're right, and I think Tamara wanted to add something to that when you made your comment. Yes, please.
No, it's just as an illustration here.
Yes.
We've been actually looking at social media in Africa for the last several months and tracking Twitter. And several months ago, when a couple of French physicians suggested that vaccine trials, or perhaps an investigation about whether the BCG vaccine was protective against COVID-19, there was an uproar on social networks in West and Central Africa, in the French-speaking networks, and on WhatsApp, on these sort of WhatsApp groups, where a whole history of human experimentation in Africa was raised. So, people were saying, we are not your guinea pigs. This is a northern problem, tested on yourselves, calling into question, just to sort of raise the kind of geopolitical questions that Stuart evoked. The relations between the Institut National de Recherche Biomédicale, the INRB in Kinshasa, and its linkages with a whole set of scientific networks in the United States and Europe. He was politically called on the carpet by various constituents. Jean-Jacques Muyembe, the head of INRB, sort of for being in the pockets of people who were promoting vaccine testing and the like. So, I think that this is just a small illustration of the ways in which these kinds of political debates come into play, and they play into whether people may actually even accept the vaccine or not, which has seemed to have gotten a lot more attention lately. I just want to, for one very small point that was made earlier by both Stuart and Vincenzo about privilege, which I would agree. This particular group is privileged. We have the capacity to do research. And for a variety of reasons, class reasons and the like. But I also want to highlight that both in the favelas that you've been working in, Vincenzo, or in Port-au-Prince, or in Amsterdam or Paris or London, we have both people who are, in a sense, connected to social networks, connected to a social fabric. And there are, every place on this planet, people who are excluded. And it's those people who are, weakened, what did they say in French, fragilisés, stigmatized, excluded, who don't have the capacity to be resilient, as people say, who don't have the capacity, in a sense, to respond to, for instance, government restrictions on mobility or on, moving around, or, inability to purchase masks and the like. And that, I think, is a question that both, physicians, governments, public health experts, and social scientists need to think about. And not only just need to think about, but need to identify and identify specific capacities to bring those people kind of into a fold. I think it's a question of building trust, of giving people the means to be able to respond to these challenges that are both medical as well as economic, as well as political and social and psychological. We've got everything in that bucket. So let me just stop there. But I just wanted to pick that up because I don't think that we need to, it's very, again, very difficult to generalize, but these vulnerable populations are ones that exist in a variety of locations. And those are the people that we really need to be responding to.
Could I just add one word to that? Because of course, I totally agree. And I, at the top of that list ought to be migrants and refugees.
Yes.
Who are not going to be high up on anybody's list of priorities for receiving a vaccine, and may even be additionally stigmatized when countries start demanding proof of vaccination in order to be given a visa.
Exactly.
So I think in both those respects, who's going to pay to vaccinate all the 20 million refugees in the world?
Exactly. Yeah.
There is another argument against this optimistic view that vaccines will lead to a return to normal and to the life as it was. And it's an historical argument. And maybe we can ask Dora to say a few words about the polio vaccine and the campaigns for polio eradications and what happened in the past in order to understand what might happen in the future. Would you please comment on that, Dora?
Yes, sure. And I would like to extend what Stuart said about how vaccines have become a geopolitical object, but that I would say that they have always been such. And I think I want to highlight two things about the history of polio vaccines that can be relevant here. One is the kind of issues that Tamara just highlighted, and the issue of trust. that's not only within populations, but in scientific communities and among political communities and geopolitical trust. Vaccines are technologies of trust because they're extremely complicated. I mean, even on a very high scientific level of understanding is needed to figure out what is in it, exactly how it works. But they're also potentially dangerous. We understand that. Many of them, not all, are made out of some version of the pathogen, and they are given to vulnerable people, children, old people. We need to trust that it works. We need to trust that it's safe, and that is often reflects the relationship between whoever is mandating the vaccine, which is usually governments or states, and the people. But it also brings in the question of the multiple vaccines. Which one is the one to go with? Which one is safe? Which one can we trust? And those also tend to line up on political grounds, tend to be favored along geopolitical allegiances. So that is also something to think about of what, because which science, and here again the problematic of this catchphrase is to be trusted, right?
Yes.
Are the Russians doing some different science, or are they lying about it, or is that to be trusted? And this was very similar during the Cold War.
Yes.
That was one
the
of the
famous debate: Salk versus Sabin vaccine, exactly. And URSS versus the United States and Europe. So yeah.
And the other thing is of what we can expect vaccines to do, and here I'm always a bit skeptical of the efficacy level of vaccines as it's proven in a lab and it's proven in trials. And I think this is how I like to think of vaccines, not just this thing in a vial that then is administered, but something that cannot be, of course, the thing in a vial doesn't make sense if you're not putting it into any bodies, and it doesn't do the work of immunizing someone. So it's inseparable from the immunization process itself. So one of the things I looked at was the Salk vaccine, which was said to be quite efficient through laboratory work, through trials, and then through national usage. It didn't work in Hungary. They didn't know it didn't work. They found out it didn't work when there was another epidemic wave that nobody was expecting. So I looked into, what makes a successful vaccine, a failure. And, there is no clear answer. There's no one culprit, but it turned out that, of course, it matters greatly on how that vaccine is administered, who's administering it, what kind of technology is available. So are from the needles to the refrigeration and so on, that needs to be the infrastructure that needs to be in place. Who is organizing it? How do you persuade the people to get it? So it's not only the anti-vaccination issue at hand, but a whole host of other things. Who's going to get it? Who's going to be prioritized? Is there enough of it? Mm-hmm. And so on and so forth. So many issues going into that vaccination process, from the model of how many days apart to mm-hmm. and that can never be replicated in any trial. That can never be replicated under laboratory circumstances. So that kind of social, political, and cultural becomes part of the scientific. It becomes part of the end number of the efficacy of a vaccine, basically, which can be different because of this in different contexts. So, and these things take time, of course, a lot of time and a lot of effort to make it happen. Not to mention that vaccination. Vaccinating one country will not solve the issue of a global pandemic or protect that country as such against the disease. And this was, for instance, the main driver for eradication programs, smallpox eradication and also polio eradication. That what is the point then when you can stop vaccinating and what is the point where you can see these cases creeping in as the holes in the vaccination programs are revealed. So it's a very long answer, but I think that there's something to be said about the political nature of vaccines as technologies, and also the kind of vaccination process that we cannot, that these numbers that are coming out from these vaccines mean something, certainly, but without the -80-degree cold chain that needs to be in place, it just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yes. There is another thing that you were reflecting about a few years ago, and I'm going to say a few words about Catherine Cudlick's idea that we are usually focusing on mortality rates during a pandemic, and we neglect the survivors. Why is it necessary to look at survivors and what happens to them, and what consequences should have those studies on policies at national and international level? What do you think, Dora?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the issues that come out, and I'm pretty confident that this will be relevant for the current pandemic as well, is the chronic conditions and the disability aspect. But there is, what Catherine Cudlick is also talking about is this heroic survival narratives of the ones who survived are, like in a battle, are heroes. But that focus also erases a lot of the suffering that was going on, and that might still be there for those who didn't survive, right? It's one of those issues. But the other thing is that that sometimes the survivors are inconvenient reminders of things that went wrong, right? The things that we didn't get right. And a lot of epidemics, sometimes, especially with high mortality, are over, and then there's some kind of restart and recuperation from that trauma. But then there are others where it lingers on in people who keep living with that disease. And with the successful vaccination, for instance, or with successful ways of controlling epidemic, when we think that it's ended, then the infrastructures that are supporting these people are, fall away, and they are still living with the disease. They might be living with long COVID, they might be living with polio, but there's no disease around, there's no epidemic around them, there's no priority around them. And this, taken to an extreme, this comes with the loss of knowledge about the disease. So all the knowledge and the research that's developed now, where is that? What happens to that? In the case of polio, a lot of the treatment and skills that were needed to treat these people vanished, even though people still needed that for the rest of their lives. Patients became the only ones who knew about these conditions. But another extreme of this is diphtheria, where it disappears so much that it becomes really difficult to diagnose, really difficult to do the lab work for it. The treatment, which is one of the oldest treatments, is almost impossible to come by. The antitoxin, it's not in stock. So the whole thing, everything falls away. And yet, if that vaccination, level drops, or there are cases that, puts the patients in a much worse position than 120 years ago, when this would be something that, was around and in the minds of people. So that's an extreme example of this kind of ending, but how that I think it's the people who survive, how they survive, and what that means, what kind of attention we're paying to them, and what kind of knowledge is, disappearing as well.
Can I just add one
Yes,
question?
yes.
Polio is a bit, I think, unique in the sense that at a certain point, and I don't know when, post-polio syndrome was identified as a distinctive condition.
Yes.
I don't think that's paralleled in any other disease, is it? I mean, that, as it were, survivors have an acknowledged extra different pathology. Are we to expect that now?
Yes.
It's not as impactful or as impressive as polio, but there were consequences long-term, generations or decades later, of the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. So the famous book by Oliver Sacks and the movie Awakenings was really, it's been hypothesized. It's not completely well established scientifically or in terms of biology, that there were long-term consequences in the nervous system of the 1918 pandemic. And one of the concerns is there may not be as clear a post-polio syndrome with the current COVID-19 virus, but there may be different kinds of consequences that are brain-based, never mind all the social, political, and other things, which are obviously very salient, but brain-based neurological impact may have cognitive deficits and impacts. And we won't know that for decades because they may be latent or tardive effects that are only manifest themselves decades later.
The recent literature acknowledges brain changes even in COVID. And the question is, what's going on? What impacts do you think it will have in long term on the mental health of adults and teenagers? A few words, maybe, Vincenzo?
I think it will have an impact. As I said, I believe that this was a generation that we marked either because of a phobia, which is reality-based or not, amplified by other factors. Those who survive will have, in many communities, in many regions, people that they know in their circle of friends that died or were severely affected or lost their livelihoods. So I think there will be both realistic, sort of hard fact-based consequences, and more subtle, complex fears, phobias, anxieties, some of which will be understandable to us as onlookers, as fellow citizens, others and researchers, of course, but others I think will be difficult to understand. It's easy to empathize with an anxious, depressed person. It's much harder to empathize with someone who's paranoid or combative and aggressive. It's easy to identify with people who show concern, much harder to identify with the people who are, or to have compassion for the people who, through either ignorance or ideology or political reasons, are part of the, what's being called the resistance to the United States. I think all these things need our efforts to understand and compassion. And I think there'll be multiple impacts. You talked about medical humanities and history. There's a very telling anecdote. There's a very important book by Günter Grass, one of his less well-known books that I've been dipping into. He was part of the Group of 47 after the debacle of the Second World War and Nazism in Germany. There was a literary and intellectual group called the Group of 47. And instead of setting that novel in 1947, he set it 3 centuries earlier in 1647. He called it the meeting at Telgt, which occurred as a real event, a real historical event. It was a group of theologians who were the great intellectuals of the time, theologians, philosophers, and they got together during the 30 Years' War to examine the impact on their society. It's worth reading for people like us, because I think it's a telling story. So it's an example, I think, of what Stuart is saying, that we're in the middle of it. We're not sure what it is yet, and we don't know what the impacts will be. But by looking at historical examples, we may get some idea The positive version of this is that I think medical history is instructive that wars have always advanced medicine, sadly, right? Our understanding of I met a wonderful pioneering cardiac surgeon in New York City when I was in medical school, Robert Litwack, who said that all the guys that came, they were men at the time, all the people that came back, the surgeons that came back from the Second World War and the Korean War, came back to the United States and immediately somersaulted over the people that had not been in war because they had all this fantastic, sad, tragic war experience of dealing with trauma, both physically and then, of course, in psychiatry, mentally as well. So we don't know what the fallout will be. Some of the fallout will be valuable. The tremendous effort that's going now into creating these vaccines will create lots of research fallout in many domains, I believe, in health. So there's a negative and a possibly guardedly positive side of all this, because there's been a tremendous investment in a vaccine. There was not a parallel investment, to my knowledge, for a vaccine for HIV. There's treatment for HIV. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV.
Yes.
And I think that's political and has to do with stigma, which is not a word that's come up yet. But the last thing I want to say is, as a social psychiatrist, is a tremendous stigma in Canada. We've seen it in Montreal, we've seen it in Toronto. It's being documented towards, Asian communities, notably the Chinese. So the stigma associated with either being part of the group that with which it's associated, either as victims, as patients, or as supposed creators of the problem. This is a very serious problem. And, we know about the stigma that was associated with AIDS. We know about the stigma that was associated with many illnesses. It's happening now. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not being discussed enough.
Indeed. And I think Tamara is is having already evidence to back your claim. As we are approaching the end of the panel, I would like to take one question from the audience. How do you think the medical system will evolve after this hard experience? A few thoughts?
I wonder if I could just quickly say
yes, please.
something. I guess what I would like to express is a hope. I think, people, and you asked a question, I think, earlier about the failure of medical systems. What I really think, and sort of speaking from my own position being in France, and, where transmission is quite high, I think it's more honestly a failure of governments to invest in public health and invest in healthcare systems. And my hope, I don't know how it will evolve, but my hope is that as people continue to speak up and, sort of protest the kind of privatization of different aspects of the medical system, that they continue to clamor for a role of the state in investing in these public health systems and health systems, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So that's my hope. I can't predict the future, but I think that people are recognizing the value of that, the importance of that.
Yes. Do you think, Tamara, that other viruses that will emerge in a few decades following the gradual melting of the ice cap, what they are going to do? Are they dangerous, maybe more dangerous than the SARS-CoV-2?
I don't think that we know, but I think that there are a number of people out there who are, collecting animals, looking to see, what is potentially shared between human beings and different kinds of animals. I mean, we've done some of that ourselves in Central Africa as well, looking at shared microbiome between humans and various kinds of domesticated and wild animals, and have in fact, identified certain, at least genera of viruses that are certainly cause for concern. For me, the answer is not to continue to, or to try to separate human beings and animals, but rather to invest in health systems, including in less wealthy countries, and particularly in less wealthy countries. Invest in training, invest in infrastructure, invest in just the capacity there. I think that that's absolutely necessary.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I would like to thank you all for these wonderful, wonderful thoughts and all these discussions about hot topics. And I would like to also thank all those present today at the Medical Humanities panel held at the MedLife 2020 conference. I wish you an excellent afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valentin and Alina, for making it happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Vincenzo.
Bye.